government conference. And every year what we like to do is bring together leaders from different sectors, politics, from the public sector, from the private sector, from the not-for-profit sector, academics and scholars, to really take on what we think are some of the most important challenges that governments around the world are facing. And we're thrilled to have you all. Some of you are repeat offenders, so welcome back. And some of you here today are obviously our own Master of Public Policy students here in the Blavatnik School, or doctoral students or researchers. Can I ask those of you who are part of the Blavatnik School at the moment, studying or researching here, to stand up in a second so that our guests know who you are and can come and ask you important questions like, where do I get a glass of water? What's it like studying here? How do I get in? So if you'd like to just stand and say a big welcome with me. So faculty, students of the school. So there's your local guides, you know, take a look at them. They're the people to ask. Terrific. Thank you. Can I say to those standing, if you want a comfortable seat to watch, it's being live streamed into the other lecture theatre, and the minute we go to questions, you can come back into the back and wave your hand, and we'll give you priority to throw in a question or your comment on the first panel. Terrific. So, for those of you that don't know, this Blavatnik School of Government is the youngest person in the room. So we are, of course, looking at the new generations in this conference, but this school is the newest of all. So we're 8 years old, and it's a school that was founded by a group of us here at Oxford University because we really felt that this, the world's greatest university on the indices that we choose to look at, and which we will choose to ignore when it no longer says that, this is the world's greatest university, could do yet more to help governments around the world, and to help them in 3 ways. To help them by starting to really look for and identify people who have not just the intellectual capability, but the vision of public service and the evidence of ability to actually get things done, the resilience and energy to get things done, to come to study here and to help them acquire the skills, the analysis, the knowledge, the depth of synthesis, and the global networks of peers who also want to bring about change, to go back and lead differently in their countries. And that's the first thing that this school does. We work with current leaders in short courses. We work with future and current leaders in our one-year Master of Public Policy. We work with researchers who are keen to do really applied and practical research, who are doing either the doctorate or who are research fellows or faculty in the school. And that's the second thing that the school does, is research. But research with a real urgency to think about what it is that governments most need to understand better. What's the evidence, what's the thinking, what's the shaping and framing that governments need to do if they're going to do better. Our starting proposition was a simple one, which is that no matter where you are in the world, a very small improvement in government can change lives for millions of people. And that's a very, very important thing, that we can work, yes, we can build startups, and over the next 2 days we're going to hear about some fantastic initiatives that are being done in countries. But in the end, the elephant in all of our rooms is government itself, which has the reach and capability to really do good by millions, or alternatively, not to. Not just sometimes to focus on the fact that government can do bad, but actually when it's not doing good, it's missing this massive opportunity to improve lives. And the third thing this school is really committed to is bringing people together who have different views and helping them forge cooperative solutions. You can disagree with somebody about a lot of things, but it's by forging common purpose with people with whom you disagree that you can create really lasting change. And we try to do that in everything that we do at the school. And it's hard. And it's becoming harder and harder in a world where people are preferring to shout at one another rather than to try to work out, okay, we disagree about 99% of things, but on the 1% of things that we agree about, why don't we do something positive together? Why don't we use our energy to do something positive rather than waste our energy simply screaming at each other? And I think for everyone in this room, every society in the world is facing that issue. And that's one of the issues, too, that we'll be looking at over these 2 days. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Professor Thomas Hale, one of the faculty of the school, who's taken a lead in putting today's conference together and will tell you a little bit more about the themes. But let me just close by saying, I should have started by saying, Your Excellencies, we're thrilled to have several ambassadors in the room. A very special welcome to you. We're thrilled to have our alumni in the room. A very warm welcome back to you. And we're thrilled to have both old friends and new friends. And we hope that by Friday, late afternoon, you will all have become properly part of the Blavatnik School of Government family. I look forward to that. Thank you for being here, and I'll turn over to Tom Hale.
Thank you, Nare, and thank you to all of you. Let me add my welcome. We're so excited to have so many interesting speakers and also participants here with us over the next few days. Our theme at this conference, this Challenges of Government conference, is the new generations. And I think we'd all probably agree there's an interesting generational shift happening all over the world in different areas of politics, in different areas of the challenges that governments face. And there's also a lot, I think we'd all agree, of, shall we say, shallow commentary in media on these kinds of trends. A lot of articles about avocado toast, about how millennials can't seem to do anything on social media, this kind of discussion. And so we think we as a school have a real value to add to this important conversation because we can leverage our unique youth as an old university with a new school and our unique kind of research and personality as an entity to look at this problem in new ways. There are 3 lenses we'd like to apply to these themes over the next 2 days. The first lens is this intergenerational one. We are looking at this question of the challenges that governments face from a range of perspectives. And we're really excited that many of you here today are coming at this from a place which is a little bit younger than many people who come to conferences at Oxford. So that's a great step. Secondly, we're looking at it through a comparative lens, because this question of generational change is similar between countries in some ways, but also quite different between countries in some ways. And we're trying to explore those similarities and differences with our global community around here in the Blavatnik School. And the third lens we want to use is not just the superficial, what are these millennials all about kind of lens, but to really bring our strength as an institution that brings together research and practice and look at that interface between rigorous academic research and world-leading practice in government to see how we can add value to the challenges governments are facing around these generational shifts. So those are the 3 lenses we're going to apply. And we're also going to try to do a slightly different format than many academic conferences that many of you have attended. So we're really going to try to emphasize the interaction, because even though we have so many great speakers coming, we have so many great audience members as well. And the wall between those 2 categories will be problematized over the next few days. So we're looking forward to all of your interactions. And to get us started on that, I thought we might begin with a small, quick exercise. And the bad news is that every single one of you has to participate in this exercise. But the good news is that to participate, all you need to know is the year in which you were born. Everyone know that? Good. So I'd like you to please stand if you were born before 1964 or before. Please stand. Welcome. So you are the baby boom, the generation of boomers. And when you entered the world, please stay standing. When you entered the world, it was the end of World War II. It was the rise of the Cold War. China was experiencing a new kind of government coming to power. India was coming out of colonialism into independence. Partition followed shortly thereafter. And around the world, the post-war depression gave way to a post-war boom with great growth around the world. was a time when the first computers were being developed, when jet travel became a commercial possibility, when people began to watch television, when modern consumer culture began to develop, and when we first began to realize things about societal changes around civil rights and other kinds of issues. So boomers, stay standing. Please stand now if you were born between 1965 and 1980. And boomers, please stay standing. Great. So, 1965 to 1980, you are Generation X, as you're called. And when you came into the world, the boomers were young people going through education and starting families and careers. And this was the time of the Cold War. It was a time of decolonization, of independence movements. It was a time of regional wars, sometimes with great power competition around them. It was a time of economic crisis for many countries, with boom and bust periods tied to oil and other crises. It was a time also when modern environmental issues first became relevant around 1968 and the 70s. And also when, around a similar time, the new wave of feminism came to the forward of political conversation, new movements such as the gay rights movement came onto the scene, and a lot of social change began to unfold in places like Woodstock, New York, and here in London. So, boomers, Generation X, please stay standing. And please be joined by everyone born between 1980 and 1994. Right. So, at this time, 1980 to 1994, the boomers were entering middle age, Generation X was in their youth and beginning to go through into their careers, and millennials, you were being born and coming into the world. So welcome, millennials. This was a time of the end of the Cold War, a process of democratization across many parts of the world, a time in economics where we saw a Reagan-Thatcher revolution, a spread of neoliberalism in global governance and around the world, and of course a period of reform and opening in China, of accelerating regional deepening in many parts of the world. And you were the first children, millennials, to grow up in houses that likely had a personal computer in them. And you were also amongst the first to experience what came next, which was people born between 1995 and today. Can you please stand up? Welcome. So you are Generation Z. And when you were born, the millennials were young people. Generation X was entering middle age. The boomers were moving toward retirement. And this was a time moving toward in a very slow, gradual track. And this was a time when history, which had ended with the millennials, came back, if you will, with decades that were characterized by war, following the 9/11 attacks, wars in the Middle East, by increasing kinds of economic strife following the 2008 financial crisis, and by the reemergence of trends around nationalism, populism that we all think about a lot these days. It was also a time of the emergence of the emerging economies, the rise of the BRICS, countries racing to escape the middle income trap, and big questions about how social welfare would develop in this time. But you were also the first Generation Z, to grow up completely digitally native. In other words, to never understand a world before smartphones and before the internet. And that is an interesting thing. You're also the first generation born at a time where the world atmosphere has warmed by 1 degree already, and in the time you were born, on track to rise much more. So here we are today in 2020, and we're now looking forward to the future. And we're going to, between the years 2020 and 2035, welcome a new generation, the generation after Generation Z, to join us. And we might call them, I don't know, Generation A, because we've run out of letters now. But Generation A is going to have a very different world. It's going to be a world where China becomes the world's largest economy in absolute terms, where India becomes the world's populous nation, where Africa is probably the most quickly growing continent, both in population and perhaps in GDP as well. And where our world is fundamentally transformed by technologies we're beginning to see emerge now, like artificial intelligence, like genetic engineering, and like the dominance of the digital space over other spaces that we've inhabited so far. So Generation A will have quite a lot to take on, but they'll be followed after 2035 by Generation B, between 2035 and 2050, when the world population reaches 9 billion. And I'm sorry, boomers, at this point, please sit down, because unfortunately, you may not be with us this time. But everyone else, please stay standing. And boomers, your places will have been taken this time by Generation A and B, right? And as we move beyond that, Generation C, between 2050 and 2075, at this point, I'm sorry, but Generation X, please sit down. There'll be a whole new generation, which we can't even predict the kinds of issues they'll be looking at. And by the time we end the century, between 2075 and 2100, there'll be Generation D, a whole fourth generation that will have risen up to take our place. So millennials, I'm sorry, we can sit down now. But Generation Z, please stay standing. So by the time our school is celebrating its 100th anniversary, which I'm sure we will celebrate in this very room in 100 years' time, or in 90 years' time, you might be back. And you'll be joined by 4 new generations, A, B, C, and D, who have thought about the challenges of government before. So as you can see, we have a wide variety of experiences here in the room, generationally speaking. And I think those experiences are going to be really interesting inputs for a discussion about the kinds of trends we'll be looking at here. So Generation Z, thank you for lasting this long on your feet. You can sit down. And thank you to everyone for remembering what year you were born. Well done. Let me just say a few words about the conference over the next few days. So we'll be looking at themes like the future of the economy, changes in technology, changes in the natural world and the environment, changes in identity and culture, and how we manage governments, cities and urbanization, and also a cross-cutting theme of how we make change. Do we do it inside government or outside government or somewhere in between, and how does that space in between government work? Let me just add a few quick logistical notes. First, we're delighted to have so many of you with us over the next few days, and that means we're going to be rigorous timekeepers, starting and ending on time so everyone has a good chance to experience the full range of each panel. So I'll ask your cooperation in helping us make sure we start and end panels on time, and also to help the people who are watching us through the live stream of this event so they can know when to tune in and when not to tune in. And that's another important point. This is being live streamed, and there's photographers walking around taking pictures. Just be aware, this is happening in the public context. Please, for that reason, turn off your mobile phones if you can, or put them on airplane mode to make sure we're not disturbing the conversation. We're going to start our next session momentarily with a transition to think about these inside-outside questions and also the role of young people in government. I'll turn back to Nari to lead that conversation. But before I do, I'm going to say one final word of thanks and one encouragement, is that I was really serious about this interaction piece. We want to hear from each and every one of you. So if you can't find time to make your point, or if you don't really feel like making your point in a plenary session like this, please find people in the hallway. Introduce yourself. If you see someone standing, having coffee by him or herself, go up and introduce yourself, because we're all here to learn something and to engage with people. And if we all leave tomorrow having met 3 interesting people who we didn't know before, we'll all consider that a big success. So please join us in that challenge for our Challenge of Government conference. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the conference.
There's 4 seats down here. They say reserved. Am I allowed to give those away? Should I auction them? No. Would you like to come up and take these seats down here, just so that maximum number of people are comfortable? Great. Well, what a pleasure to start today's conversation with 3 speakers who have at least 2 things in common with one another. We've got a third who has a short video message. The first, and of course the most important, is their relationship with the Blavatnik School of Government. And I'll explain their respective relationships when I introduce them. But the second is that each has the distinction of being the youngest cabinet minister in their region or country. And we thought it would be good to start with these 3 to open up some of the challenges that governments are actually facing. It bears noting that there's a number of different reports, like the International Interparliamentary Union report, which keep telling us that most of the world's politicians are elderly, white, male, but some of them do a fabulous job, so that's not a disdainful comment. We're starting to sound ageist this morning. But in virtually every country of the world, it's hard to see that those who have been elected to represent the people represent all the different groups in a society, which are generational, which are racial, which are by income, which are by gender, and that there's a lot to do to make our representatives look more like the societies that they represent. Our focus, of course, in this conference is the generational divide. So I'm going to introduce each speaker as I introduce them to make an initial remark. But so let me start with the gentleman on my right, the Right Honourable Syed Saddiq, who is Minister of Youth and Sports in Malaysia. Saddiq applied to come to study the Master of Public Policy in 2017. I think that was the year. We offered him a place. We could see the leadership potential. At the last minute, he declined to come because he wanted instead to run for Parliament in the Malaysian elections, and he very quickly became minister. Normally people do the MPP before becoming minister, but Syed went straight ahead. And I guess I can't help but ask you, Syed, now that you've been minister for nearly 2 years, what is it that you wished you had come and learnt before you became minister?
There will be a lot of things. Yesterday we had a conversation about finding a way to maintain one's principles when they join politics, while at the same time ensure that idealism don't get drowned out by pragmatism, because you do not want to lose the key struggles and battles which are to come. About 1.5 years ago, Malaysia went through its very first democratic transition after more than 61 years. So it's not an easy time. We went through it peacefully, but with that comes the need and the drive to push for long-term institutional reforms. But while doing so, if you go too fast and ram into the wall, the fear is that there will be a big pushback by the electorate, which then, when the next election comes, a lot of the key institutional reforms can be ripped apart because we failed to affect and change the hearts and minds of the electorate, which matters the most. So it's not only about institutional reforms or legislative changes, but it's to ensure that attitudes change, hearts and minds change, so that even when there is a change in government, and I believe now in Malaysia it will happen often, because that's the beauty of a democracy, but it's to ensure that democratic traditions continue, and that's definitely one thing which I think I'll have a great time learning in Blavatnik.
I remember when you applied, you'd won Best Debater in all of Asia 3 years in a row. So I think on the persuasion stuff, you were already slightly ahead. But you know, now you're the youngest minister in Asia, serving the oldest prime minister in the world. Yeah. That's kind of interesting. So is there a generational divide in Malaysia? Is there a sense that people under 40, people under 30 have a different priority or set of priorities than people in the older generation?
There definitely is. In many ways. First things first, let's face it that young people in politics are inherently disadvantaged. Why do I say this? They don't have the same networking opportunities like those who are much more experienced. They don't have the same financial resources like those who have been there for a very long time. The turnout rate of the youth electorate in comparison to those who are much older is lower. But if young people are fearful to take up the challenge, to disrupt and innovate, then we'll never get anywhere. That's why I always believe that it's critical to have that critical mass to get more and more young people in, breaking the wheel, not just following the same traditional path. And with that comes the narrowing of that age gap of idealism. For example, in Malaysia, I remember when I was pushing for the constitutional amendment to reduce voting age from 21 to 18 years old, which will mean that there will be an increase of 7 million new voters in Malaysia, but a one-third increase in the electorate. There was a big pushback by the older community. It took me about a year to convince my cabinet colleagues, and for there to be a bipartisan success, because we've never had bipartisanship win, especially when it comes to constitutional amendment, because government didn't have two-thirds support, so we had to convince the opposition coalition. and that's never happened before. I think just 3 months before I pursued it, a constitutional amendment was struck down. It was on a less controversial issue, but even then it was struck down. But I remember the point is where you get young people clamoring for it because they want their voices heard. They want to ensure that if the issues of employment and underemployment are taken seriously, they want to ensure that they are not left on the sidelines. They want issues of cost of living to be resolved. They want housing issues to be resolved. These are key central messages which are very close to the hearts and minds of young people. But when they become more and more vocal, absolutely no one can ignore their voice, because if they do, they'll be kicked out and they will lose the next election.
Is there a number one issue for young people? Like you mentioned a number: housing, unemployment, cost of living. What would you say is the sort of number one issue that distinguishes them from the older generation?
If you notice, the broad theme is still the economy. But for young people, I believe it's jobs, but not just the creation of jobs, but quality jobs. Underemployment is a big issue. And you realize that there's a big age gap or ideological gap here, where the older generation will keep on telling the youth that or you don't deserve this pay, that you are underskilled or unskilled, that you are too complacent, and that, I mean, in general, there's this very negative tone thrown at young people. But in reality, young people are very hungry for change. They want to take up these opportunities. They want to disrupt and they want to innovate. So that's why I believe if there is no shift in attitudes and mindsets, I believe there will be a big, I wouldn't say a physical revolution, but there will be a big silent revolution like what happened in the last election, when great pessimism targeted on young people was removed by great optimism, and young people turned out in droves during election day, and were the ones who defined the very first time change in government in Malaysia. They were the defining factors. And for next election, there's an increase of 7 million new voters now, which is 1/3 of the electorate. They will become the kingmakers of Malaysian democracy.
Thank you, Saddiq. To my left is the Right Honourable Kate Forbes, Minister for Public Finance and the Digital Economy in the Government of Scotland. Welcome back, Kate. Kate first visited the school in 2017, gave a wonderful session here in the school. And Kate, it really is a pleasure to have you back and to reinforce your membership of this Blavatnik school family. You studied history at Cambridge and then at Edinburgh, and focused on history and migration and human migration. And I've noticed that in your time as an MP, you've picked up that issue, as well as the minister led, one of the several things that you've led was the campaign on plastic straws, the environmental issues. So I guess I would come to you first to say, is there a generational divide in Scotland, do you think? Are there a set of issues and priorities that younger voters, that the younger part of the electorate that you represent would put first?
I think there's quite a profound generational divide in Scotland right now. And at the moment, if you think the Constitution runs through politics, in Westminster it certainly runs through politics. In Scotland, but it's a different constitutional question, and it's the question of Scottish independence. And I put that out there as the major issue which I believe divides the generations, not completely by any means, but all polling demonstrates that under the age of 35, there's far more support for an issue like that than above the age of 65. But in a sense, I would say that's symbolic of the ways in which the different generations have had to grapple with the same challenges. So whether that's the challenges of post-2008, economic uncertainty and risk, how young people have responded is by believing that there could be a better future in constitutional terms, although the point about jobs also applies. And I think, too, the tools of our politics, young people have responded differently. So one of the things that came through the independence referendum, and I think is increasingly dominant in our other big issue politics, is, of course, social media. And again, social media really inspired a whole generation of young people in Scotland, and they perhaps were then more persuaded by the arguments on independence. Those sentiments, as it were, are then reflected in those that seek elected office. So if you look at the House of Commons, the party with the most members under the age of 40 are the SNP, and the parties with the most candidates under a certain age are also my party. So for all the economic uncertainties and risk of taking political office, when a movement ushers in young people, you really see that being reflected in the numbers that are taking up elected office.
And in representing those issues and being the youngest minister, what for you are the advantages that come from that, but also what are the challenges?
Well, there are certainly a lot of challenges. You can't expect automatic respect. You have to earn it. And I learned that very quickly, I think a few weeks after being appointed a minister, going to do an official engagement. And the First Lady, who I met, shook my hand and said, "Lucky you getting a day off school." So you have to, which was only marginally better than being mistaken for a very senior male politician's wife. So you do have to prove yourself a little bit more. But I think that if, to Saddiq's well-made point, that in 2015 we allowed young people down to the age of 16 to be able to vote. So there is an electorate there, aged 16 and 17, who can vote in Scottish Parliament elections and local authority elections, who are looking for people to support. And they want to see people that reflect themselves and reflect the issues that they care about. And so from that perspective, to answer your question, I think there's a huge opportunity to be a voice for young people. I can't, remember the countless number of trite initiatives that have been deployed to engage young people by governments that know their votes are important. And so often they're quite offensive because they treat young people as though they've got little more to say than on a few key areas. And I remember taking part in one such event on behalf of a committee, looking around the room. This was our engagement with young people, thinking, half the people in this room are older than me, and I'm elected, and they're seeking elected office. So I think the advantage is that there's an electorate out there who want to see representatives like them and are fed up with the politics of the past. But there are, of course, inherent disadvantages of having to prove yourself, particularly when your portfolio includes finance and technology. I'm young and I'm female. Two, as it were, demographics that are not highly represented in those two areas.
Thank you. Now we have just a very short clip by a third panelist who couldn't join us today, and I'll explain why in a second. But Rafat Al-Alkali was the founder of Resonate Yemen, which was a youth democracy movement. Before coming to do the Master of Public Policy, yes, there's a theme here, at the Blavatnik School of Government, and then returning to Yemen, first to lead the Executive Office on Policy Support Issues, but then to become the youngest minister there for youth and sports in Yemen. He's now back here. Obviously, there's been a war raging in Yemen, and he's back here in the school working on how you can reconstruct states that are in very fragile conditions, post-conflict reconstruction and in-conflict construction. And that's what's taking him up today. So he's recorded a short video. Could we have the short video comment by Rafat prepared for this?
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Blavatnik School of Government. My name is Rafat Al-Akali, and I'm sorry I couldn't be with you today at the school because I'm actually in Singapore on a course on smart cities. I originally come from Yemen, where I co-founded an organization called Resonate, which works with young people and works on engaging young people in public policy. Resonate and myself and a lot of my friends and colleagues have been part of the youth movement in Yemen and of the protest movement that happened in 2011. And after the 2011 changes that occurred in Yemen, I wanted to really be influencing from inside the government rather than trying to influence the government from the outside, which is why I came to the Blavatnik School and I did my Masters of Public Policy. And I went back to Yemen after that and joined the government. I was the team lead for policy reforms before being appointed as Minister of Youth and Sports, where I continued in that role until the war unfortunately broke out in the country and we had to leave. And I rejoined the school and have been coordinating the school's activities on addressing state fragility. But today I wanted to share with you a reflection on one of the challenges facing young people in Yemen and in many other countries that I engage with, which is the challenge of organizing and making an impact in the long term. Young people typically have a lot of energy and want change to happen now and are successful in many times in making an impact and making historic changes in their countries in those moments of change. But the real work comes on the day after, the work of continuing to influence and continuing to drive the country in the direction that young people would like to see it go. And that requires a high level of organizing, of building sustainable collective work that channels all the individual actions into a real impact. And building, political movements, political parties, civil society organizations that can continue that work with a real long-term agenda. And in many cases, that becomes very difficult for young people who either have, lives of their own, work to go to beyond, the moments of protest that they join, or are getting co-opted in a way into joining public office, which, while making them able to make an impact from inside government, takes them away from the ability to organize and to build grassroots support and bases that can help them influence the political landscape of the country. And so I think one of the key challenges that I hope would be discussed in this conference is how young people can organize themselves for the long term and to have an impact in the long term. I hope you will enjoy the 2 days of discussions during the conference, and you'll have productive discussions on this and other topics. Thank you.
So Rafat is strongly, he's saying something that I'm sure resonates for most people in the room.
Key challenges that I hope,
if you've come up through student politics in your university, you know that student politics is about the quick hit. You're not there for long, you make the quick hit, you move on. And then when you join governments, as these fantastic ministers on my left and right have done, you quickly realize that the quick hit doesn't actually change much. It might be a newspaper headline, it might be what politicians like to call an announceable, but it's not actually changing the lives of people. Now, I'd like to open up to you to draw in half a dozen questions or very brief comments to the ministers here on stage. So can I open it up to you? And you'll forgive me if I interrupt you so as to make enough time for others also to make comments. Great, so at the back, and please introduce yourself.
Hi, hello. Cool. I'm Brian, I'm the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Political Review and the MPhil in political theory at Wolfson here. So thank you very much for your sharing, Jocelyn. I'd just like to ask a very quick question concerning a dilemma that I think a lot of youth activists and politicians face in general, and that's if you want to achieve sort of changes to structures and policies in government, you either seem to need to go down a path of entering the actual administration and the establishment, or instead choosing to go down the path of becoming a civil society activist and trying to change the structure from the outside. When making that particular choice of presumably kind of entering the former as opposed to the latter, what were the factors that affected your decision making, and how would you sort of translate your own experience to any messages or thoughts that you'd impart to aspiring politicians and youth in that sense? Thank you very much.
That's probably the question I get asked the most by people coming to the school. Which way should I go? Other questions? Yeah.
Hi there, I'm James, an MPP student here from New Zealand. I had a brief question. So obviously you being in a youth representative role has a lot of value. You're able to mobilise the youth vote and so forth. Are you able to describe to us your experiences of being unofficially or officially labelled as simply being that youth representative by your elders and perhaps not being taken seriously on the likes of finance issues or those big people topics? I'd be interested in hearing your experiences.
Thank you, James. And then down here. Can we have a microphone here?
Thank you. My name is Siddharth, and I am an MPP student at Sciences Po in Paris, and I'm here to attend this wonderful conference. The question that I have is, when working from the outside, what I've observed is that the grit that you require is so much more than what you require inside. So you had mentioned that it took you a year to convince the cabinet that this is the direction to move in. But if you're outside, it's probably going to take you 50 years or something of that sort if you want to work on it. So how do you think you would measure one amongst the other when trying to understand if it's better to be on the inside or on the outside?
Mm-hmm. It's another inside-outside question. And then a question here. This lady here.
Selamat pagi, YB. With the stigma, as you know, there's a huge...
do introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. My name's Carmen. I'm a student at Oxford International College. As you know, with this heavy stigma in Malaysia regarding the youth and politics, how would you encourage political activism and engagement in politics and the youth when we are so discouraged not to do anything?
Mm-hmm. Terrific. One more question here.
Good morning. My name is Kule Duma from Anglo-American. I'm the International and Government Relations Advisor there, and from South Africa. So in the work that we do, we talk about the future of work quite often, especially in a South African context with high unemployment, an economy heavily dependent on coal and minerals. Have you started thinking about what the future of government would be? Because we always talk about the future of industry, but is there space to actually talk what the future of government would be, what a new welfare system for transitioning economies would actually mean? Thank you.
Excellent. And one last question. We have the former acting mayor of Afghanistan at the back, who you'll be hearing from tomorrow. But shall I...
deputy mayor and acting mayor of my time, which was just about 4 years ago in Kabul, Afghanistan, and I relate to a lot of the content that was shared from both the excellency ministers. I like to make an observation and share a question. My observation from my own experience is that being young, relatively speaking, because it's different in different contexts, it's such a high-profile job, I felt it was very limiting, because you're labeled as only being concerned with a specific portfolio of the youth. So I had to kind of fight back and not always represent the youth perspective, because as the mayor, I had to engage and represent various age categories and demographic constituents. So that's the observation. My question is, in your specific jobs, are there times when you have to kind of break from that chain and demonstrate that you can represent non-youth perspective and non-youth interests as well? Thank you.
We had sort of three themes raised. The first is how you choose between working outside the system and inside the system, a theme that will also be picked up in the next panel. The second is around whether you're just representing youth, whether it's tokenistic, whether you can represent others as well. A third is around the future of government, which the Minister of Digital will, doubtless have some things to say. And I'd like to throw in one further question to you. You're each from countries that have a very strong strand of nationalism in your current political debate. Scotland, the Scottish nationalists on the rise once again. In Malaysia, a Malaysia dignity movement which is causing real consternation among minorities in Malaysia, but rallying other parts of Malaysia. And that's, of course, something that reflects in this country, our host country, at the same time. I think I probably do need to note that today, the 31st of October, was one of the several dates on which Britain was going to leave the European Union. Yeah, we did it. Should we do it then? Should we not? We ended up banking on the unpredictability of the current British political system. But that issue is one which has divided generations in Britain. Some 70% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted to remain. Interestingly, of the 30% who voted to leave, 30% of the youth, 18 to 24-year-olds, voted to leave, and half of those, more than half, 64% were male, and half of those said that the most important issue for them was their aversion to cultural diversity, right? It was about cultural diversity, immigration, crime, and defense. By contrast, that same demographic, the 18 to 24-year-olds who voted to remain, put things like education at the top of their priorities. So, and it's just to remind us, let's not lump all youth together. There are some very clear divides, as you would expect among a younger generation. But I think the Leave vote highlighted a strand in Britain as well of a yearning for a particular kind of national community, which poses real questions about the rights of a majority to have their cultural integrity, etc., and the rights of minorities and how we do that. So I'd really like to ask you what your vision of nationalism is for your countries. Tom Hale showed us what the demographics will look like. This is an issue that will define each of your countries in the decades to come, and I think it would be useful for this audience to hear what you think that vision is. So, who would like to start? Kate.
Well, in terms of vision of for nationalism, it's interesting. I mean, you will know, I'm speaking specifically about a Scottish context, obviously, but every single local authority area in Scotland voted to remain. So we're coming at it from a slightly different perspective, not everybody, but a slightly different perspective. But I remember speaking to a Guardian journalist who commented, she was based in London, but commented that she hadn't heard a single Scottish politician saying anything anti-immigration in the last 3, 4, 5 years. And I would suggest, I'm not suggesting that Scotland is exceptionally good in any way, and I think that there are undercurrents, but I would say in terms of our public rhetoric, there has not been an association with things like immigration or ethnicity with the vision for independence. Now, there's always undercurrents, and I'm not denying that, but certainly through the constitutional discussions we've had around Brexit, immigration has not featured on a Scottish political platform in that respect. A lot of the rhetoric is the fact that we don't want to be taken out of the EU, and our future economic prosperity actually depends and relies on people moving to the country. So even issues such as the proposed immigration cap, with the 30k cap for immigrants coming in, would be a problem in a country like Scotland, where the average wage is much lower than England, for example. So I would say that there's a distinction. Although my party is the Scottish National Party, it's not actually the Scottish Nationalist Party, although our vision is for independence. It is a centre-left, inclusive vision for independence, that if you want to move to Scotland, if you choose to live in Scotland, you want to work in Scotland, you're very welcome, and please work with us to make Scotland more prosperous. Now, that's not just a party political broadcast, but the point is, I think, at a national level, those issues of ethnicity and immigration have not featured in our discussions about independence to the same extent that they've featured in other constitutional discussions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So, an inclusive nationalism. So, just on this issue of nationalism, Saddiq, is there a risk that Malaysia, there are obvious historic reasons for indigenous empowerment and such like that come from Malaysia's colonial history, and other countries, South Africa for one, share some of that. But is there a risk now in modern Malaysia that you're heading towards an exclusive form of nationalism, which says that only these Malays, only Malays with this particular visible identity, have full rights?
I think as time passes by, Malaysian politics will become more and more multiracial, but in the next 1 or 2 terms, we'll have to make some of the most toughest decisions and toughest times. Last election, as I mentioned, was the first time change in democratic government after 61 years. And when that change happened, the Malay majority actually voted for the opposition coalition today. The government today had less than 30% of Malay support. So there is a perceived narrative that there's a sense of loss in Malay power and interest by this new government. But I think as the new budget reflects, that's categorically untrue. We're still investing a lot in education, opportunities to ensure that the economic wealth can be equitably distributed. But the reason why I say it's tough, because when there is that first-time change and perceived loss in power, there will be a strong pushback. That's where you see we are also being confronted by almost an ultra-ethnic nationalist coalition, which doesn't just combine race but also religion, from opposition parties like PATH and UMNO, forming one of the biggest Malay religious blocs in Malaysia, which then compels us in government to respond. And how do we respond? At the same time, we have our support base at the moment demanding for us to make quick, critical changes to what the Malaysian identity truly is. So then it begs the question, how do we move forward? We cannot simply maintain status quo. At the same time, we can't turbocharge forward to the point that you lose sight on actual democratic pragmatism, where you may break the coalition apart or you may lose the next election and therefore all the important reforms have been backtracked. I believe the future of Malaysia is that while the youth will be the defining factor, as I mentioned, 7 million new voters coming into the electorate, I firmly believe that my generation is more open-minded and multiracial looking, right? So they will change the electorate to a great extent. And while racial and religious identity will still be important, right? But people will still associate themselves as Malaysian first. And I believe that the way in which we approach for economic policies on redistribution will not just be on the basis that I'm Malay and therefore I am entitled to 10 different things, but will be about how do we best ensure that we can equitably distribute profits in Malaysia or wealth in Malaysia towards poor Malays who are affected the most, who are disadvantaged the most. So it'll be more on a public policy approach which combines need-based and also race-based, acknowledging that there is subconscious discrimination which still exists in Malaysia. So similarly, when Dato' Sri Nazir's father, Tun Abdul Razak, envisioned for the NEP, it wasn't meant to be permanent, but there was a timeline. And it was a public policy approach to ensure that Malay equity could reach 30%. And there was an increase. In 1970s, Malay equity was only at 2.7%. There were only about 6 to 7 Malay graduates in the School of Medicine and Engineering in University Malaya. But now we see a lot more coming up. They are professionals, they are in the middle income, in the T20 as well. The point is to ensure that we can redistribute the pie equitably and acknowledge that the Malaysian identity is critical to act as a uniting factor of all Malaysians, but at the same time respect a person's right to associate to a particular race and religion and remain to be proud of it. So it will be a difficult path. It's not easy, as I mentioned, because it's a first-time change government. It was an unholy coalition of different ideologies, but we had a common enemy then. Now we don't. That common enemy is being tried, so it's a different case. And at the same time, when you fully liberated the media, Malaysian media index has improved by far, corruption index has improved by far, many institutional reforms made. But when you free up the space of discussion, again, that's when nothing is hid under the rug and it's discussed in open. So there will be pushback. But I'm optimistic that the youth will win this battle and Malaysia will win and will become a force to reckon with in the next 10 to 20 years.
Great. And I think he almost said, and that was not meant to be a party political broadcast. But anyway, but thank you. Thank you for answering that. Just briefly then, Kate, what made you choose between, I mean, did you ever sit, as Brian and others in the room have asked, did you ever sit and think, should I work outside the system or shall I join the system and work inside?
Absolutely. I had multiple identity crises. And I started off by working in the system, as part of the system, got totally cheesed off, totally cynical, thought politics never changed anything, so left the system, and then went back into the system. And after 3.5 years, I'm resigned to the fact that I can't change the world. But I've been able to change small things. And I think for me, what I've acknowledged over the last 3.5 years is it's those that persevere that change things. Internally and externally, there are challenges to change, but perseverance pays off, and building networks and alliances pays off. And I see, particularly amongst young people, some very powerful workers and operators who are able to build those networks and alliances, who've done more to change politics in 6 months than I've done in 3.5 years. But those are the factors that are required, whether you're inside or outside. So my advice would be build those networks, build those alliances, figure out what you're standing for, and then persevere. You get the opportunity to stand for election, go for it. If you don't, you can probably still see through change.
Would you add anything to that?
Definitely. Because there was almost like a false dichotomy whether you join the government or you become an external pressure force. I'm of the firm belief that the youth must disrupt and continue to disrupt in as many ways as possible. I was a part of the system as well. I was an officer to the de facto Minister of Law. I witnessed blatant corruption and abuse of power done by the government then. Decided to speak out, lost my job as a part-time lecturer in the university and as a researcher for the Johor think tank. But instead of just becoming an external pressure force, I said, if I am to join another already well-established political party in the Westminster system, it takes years, if not decades, to climb up. You disrupt it. You form a new political party, make sure that those who share the same idealism join on board. At the same time, you enter the election and create a new narrative and message, unite opposition coalition together to win the election. The point is, the youth must be daring enough to disrupt and do not fear change by either picking to join the government or to become an external pressure force. I mean, in many countries, we see the rise of youth movements, whether it's within established political parties or those young people who are daring enough, for example, in Thailand, to form the party of their own.
And just, do you ever feel tokenistic? The question on tokenistic? I mean, 94-year-old Prime Minister, 26-year-old Minister, it sort of reduces the average, sort of brings the average to a kind of...
Exactly where I was going to go. I'm honestly privileged to have that 94-year-old Prime Minister. Because if he did not care about youth issues, he would never bother to appoint a 25-year-old minister. But beyond that, enable me and allow me to bring millions of other people into the political front line. When we amend the Constitution from 21 to 18 years old, he was one of the biggest driving forces. When we reduced the age of youth from 40 to 30, he was a driving force. Paid internship, now a reality in Malaysia, he played a role. Decriminalization of drug addiction, he played a role. A landmark 6.5 billion job stimulus plan, which targets youth who are unemployed, he played a big role. The point is, the way in which you remove tokenism is to ensure when you are in power as a young person, you don't only focus on yourself, you bring millions of other people with you on board. Now we see a lot of young people being appointed as CEOs and chairmen and board members of the big corporates in Malaysia. PNB, a multi-billion-dollar portfolio, is being run by a 36-year-old. In the National Economic Action Council, one of the most pivotal economic units in Malaysia, chaired by the PM, has 3 people who are below 30 being represented on board. Government agencies who were previously run by those who are 50 years and above now are run by those in their mid-30s. So the point where you bring all of them into the front line, then even if I lose power, and that's the beauty of democracy, we normalize young leadership in every single layer of decision-making. That's when tokenism fails and youth empowerment is institutionalized.
Thank you, Saddiq. Kate, one quick word from you about the future of government, given that you are Minister for Digital. Anglo-American done a lot of work on the future of work and digital, etc.
And I think young people are pushing that future in particular. Really briefly on that point, I'm not the Minister for Young People, I'm the Minister for Finance, and I prove my worth by being Minister for Finance rather than being Minister for Young People. And you've got to earn it. Nobody's going to give you anything on a plate in that regard. And I think you don't get special privileges by virtue of who you are or what age you are either. In terms of the future of government, it's one of the most fascinating areas that we're looking at the moment in terms of digital. And there's quite a lot of research going on at Edinburgh University that we're partnering with in terms of how we use digital methods to, I suppose, empower people when it comes to participation and voting. All the parties are falling over each other in terms of reaching young people and all ages through digital means. But I think that's come with an element of suspicion and questions about ethics too, which have probably set the debate back several years in terms of digitising participation and democracy, particularly in recent campaigns, which you can read into what I'm saying in that regard. So I think that debate's moved back, and we need more work done to build consent and the ethical framework for how we change government before we change government. But if we don't get the ethical framework in place, then, as I say, with parties trying really hard to overtake one another using digital means, we're going to get into even bigger difficulties.
Thank you very much. Look, we've run out of time on this session, but just before we close, lest we end on a kind of ageist, let's lump everybody into categories thing, I do want to point out that one of the best applications I've seen for a doctorate at Oxford came from an 85-year-old applicant who wanted to begin his new career in academia, which I thought was terrific. One of the people I have taught that felt that they were too old to change course, I mentioned to a couple of you last night, informed me that he was too old to change course. I said, but how old are you? And he solemnly said, I'm older than you think. I'm 19 3/4. And I love it when the 3/4 still matters. The point is that we've called this conference The New Generations, because the new generations is not just about age. It's also about mindset. And that's why we've called it the New Generations. We had a visitor to the school last week who introduced himself as a 17-year-old who just happened to be in a 74-year-old body, and remonstrated with me for the fact that the school does not have a presence on TikTok, which apparently shows that we're already too old. So I just wanted to finish with that note to say everybody in this room is a new generation of sorts. And we're now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Emily Jones, who is going to moderate, or animate, I should say. We were told last night, don't moderate, don't calm people down, animate, get people going. On this question that we've already raised this morning on inside versus outside, where do you work within the system, which is true if you're an 85-year-old trying to work out where to change the world, or a 19 3/4-year-old working out where you want to change the system. But could you join me in a huge vote of thanks to the Right Honourable Kate Forbes and the Right Honourable Saddiq Syed, who have come all this way. Thank you. Thank you. Fabulous. Fantastic.